When I think about powerful women that come to mind, fourth in front, I think of Alice Paul, Lucy Burns, and Ida B. Wells, who led a progressive movement. Today, I wanted to speak about that movement, which gave women the rights to vote. It was called the suffrage movement. And these three women were key orchestrators that led us to having the 19th Amendment, which gave us the right to vote. Schuessler of the New York Times calls it a complex history of struggle. As a member, personally, of the National Organization for Women, we look forward to celebrating Alice Paul with a museum in Mount Laurel that celebrates her. According to the National Women's History Museum, Alice Paul was born on January 1st, 1984, in Mount Laurel, New Jersey. She was the daughter of Tacey Perry and a wealthy Quaker businessman who embraced gender equality, education for women, and working to improve society. Her mother was a suffragette, and her mother brought Alice to suffragette meetings, which would influence Alice at a young age. After Alice obtained her master's degree in Columbia University, she obtained it in sociology. She went over to England where she met Lucy Burns. And giving you a brief history on Lucy was in social welfare, says Lucy Burns was born in Brooklyn, New York. She was born into an Irish Catholic family. So over in England together, Lucy and Alice learned elements of the suffrage movement in England, where they learned the methods of protest, picketing, and hunger strikes, which they would use going forward in the United States. So they both came back to the U.S. and they joined the National Women's Party in an attempt to lobby Congress, which was unsuccessful. The National Women's Party looked at them like they were too radical. The women's movement was tied into Woodrow Wilson, and it was more like a social country elite club where, it was a lot of wealth involved in that, and they were comfortable in their positions. They weren't ready to embrace radical. So at the time, our country was in war. It was World War II. And the National Women's Movement said, look, this isn't the time to pass this legislation. Men are dying overseas. It's not popular. So, when the war broke out, the support, they threw their support behind the war. And they abandoned the progressive movement. So they had separate agendas. And the progressive movement did not listen. They then organized protests, and it backfired. They also, it sort of backfired, but they really did ultimately get what they wanted. So, and they only did that because Congress, wouldn't really respond to them when they tried to lobby them. So they had to do what they had to do. And so they took the movement to the streets, where they recruited more women. They recruited women from factories. Labor was an issue. And they told the women, look, join our movement of voices of vote. You will have a vote, and you can vote regarding putting that fire escape in the factory, which will save lives. So that was a way, and they did recruit a lot of women. And then they took to the streets, and they had picket signs. And one of their picket signs said, Mr. President, how long must we wait for liberty? So, as the history story claimed, on November 14th, 1917, 33 women were arrested after protesting, and they endured brutal beatings. They went on hunger strikes, they were force-fed, and it is said that a senator's wife who was involved in the movement slipped a note to her husband when he came to visit her. And when he got that note, he slipped that note to the press. And once that hit the press, people were furious. When they heard, this is how you treat a senator's wife, and this is how you're treating women, the movement gained popularity, and overall, the public became supportive of women's rights to vote. So, also, there were abolitionists that were involved in the movement. They were groups such as the American Anti-Slave Society provided women with the opportunity to speak, write, and organize on behalf of enslaved people, and in some cases gave them leadership roles. So this was a group of strong women, and the suffrage movement tried to leave them out of the movement with arguments like, look, they're not going to support this because you're going to have racist senators that aren't going to throw their votes in. And they had their arguments, but these black women, they showed up. They didn't care. They're like, we're going to be a part of it. We want to make sure we get the right to vote. So suffrage activist Ida B. Wells, the Chicago-based anti-lynching and women's suffrage activist, she was a suffrage activist, made sure that black women were present in the movement. And thus, now you have an idea. You can look back at history of the women's movement. The 19th Amendment wasn't an easy piece of legislation to pass. It was tough. And women suffered, including the abolitionists. They were incarcerated. Women were brutally beaten. Some lost their lives in the movement. They overcame such obstacles, even during such a time as World War I. And they won the rights to vote. Eventually they gained the popularity. So on August 18th, 1920, the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was passed, giving all women the right to vote. Yes, all women gained the right to vote. This right to vote paved a way that gives women a voice in the elections we exercise our right in today. It gives us the freedoms that we have today. The amendment passed at the very last women. It is said, so the story is said, that a senator received a phone call from his mother the last minute, and he changed his vote. He threw his vote in the last minute, and we won.